Hello, today we are going to be going over Chapter 16, 1854 to 1890, entitled Conquering a Continent. Now, we are going to start off with the Republican vision. Now, at this point, Congress is launching what they are referring to as a transcontinental rail project. That is a railroad that goes transcontinental from east to west, west to east, Atlantic to the Pacific Ocean, and that is there in that map of the blue and the red. It's ultimately going to meet in the middle of Utah and will allow for goods to be transported easier east to west. They're also establishing a new banking system and creating something known as a protective tariff, which is a tax or a duty on foreign producers of goods coming into the United States. So how does the tariff or duty work? For instance, there with the image, if something is made in Britain, it costs $4. There's a 20% tariff. So now people in the Americas are going to be paying $5, and $1 of that tariff would be going to pay the federal government taxes and different things. So the Republicans are starting to view the expansion and the economic power that the American continent can have. There is also the new union and the world. Merchants and manufacturers are also starting to look for Asia, or towards Asia, for more trading opportunities. And at this point, Asia is pretty well closed up. They do not want to interact and trade, but we have the Treaty of Kanagawa, which allows for U.S. ships to refuel in two ports in China and, in Japan. And before this time, though, Japan was very much an isolationist. They did not want to get involved, and America came in and kind of forced their hand and said, hey, all these other countries, America and Britain to name two, need you and you need us. And so we ended up with this treaty. Mexico is in a little bit of political turmoil. They're kind of bouncing between presidents and different influences. And so America starts to get involved with that a little bit. And we have William Seward, who is part of the American expansionist leadership, and he purchases Alaska from Russia for America to have as new land. He also helped to open China to U.S. missionaries, this idea of spreading Christianity over there, and he also helped set up some rules for Chinese immigrating to America, which was a big deal at that time because there were a lot of Chinese and other Asians that were coming to America to work on the transcontinental railroad and different things. Now, as far as the national economy was going, for the most part, things were going well. We did have some slowdowns, some issues, but ultimately they realized that in order for an economy to increase and improve, they needed a railroad. So the railroad was essential. And the way that the railroad was able to be built and established was what they call private ventures. So it would be individual corporations, individual companies that would build and produce the railroad, but they would get loans and subsidies and land grants by the government. So the government would give them money and give them discounts at certain things and give them land in order to build and supply these railroads. And these protective tariffs that we mentioned a second ago helped the industries of textiles and steel and sugar and wood and sugar beets and sheep. And the reason it did that, or how it did that, was it encouraged people to buy American as opposed to buying other countries because those other things were a little more expensive. Now, post-Civil War, land in Arizona and New Mexico was taken over from Mexican landowners to Anglos or to whites, and this is going to cause some contention. We also are put on what's known as the gold standard. So for $1 of paper money, there would be an equal amount of gold. And if you wanted to, you could go into your local bank whenever and say, can I trade in this paper currency for gold? And they would be bound to do that. Currently, we are not on the gold standard, but back then we were and instituted the gold standard. Now, moving out west, we have the Homestead Act of 1862, which gives 160 acres to anyone who comes out and wants to occupy, so they want to live on this land, and they want to improve it, farm on it, grow things on it, irrigate it, those types of things. And the federal government would give them this land. Now, states could also sell other land to help raise money for colleges. This was called the Morrill Act. and they would be able to sell land, take that money, and establish colleges. You have the Comstock Lode, which was a massive mining find in Virginia City, Nevada. In 1870, there were 100 saloons in Virginia City, Nevada. There were thousands of people there. It was a boom town. All of a sudden, it exploded. Today, it only has about 800 people and is now what you would call a bust. Okay, it's kind of like a ghost town, and you can see a picture of one of the main streets there down at the bottom. Mining was one of the big aspects of out west. It still is in the state of Nevada and out west. And there were other things, timber and produce, that the Pacific Northwest needed, were all very essential to people all throughout America at this time. Now, out on the plains, you would have bison. And these bison or buffalo are being killed off. By the 1870s, there were fewer than 200. Now, the big issue with this is the cattlemen would come, they would kill the buffalo, they could kill multiple at a time, and then they would just take the skin and leave everything else to rot. Now, the native people who have lived here for hundreds of years were very reliant upon the buffalo and used every piece. They used the skin, they used the bones, they used the meat, they used the organs, every piece the natives would use. And so this is going to lead to some conflict and contention because the white men are coming and only taking the skin, whereas the natives were reliant upon these buffalo, and by the 1870s, only a couple hundred left. There were 5 million longhorn cattle in Texas. There you can see a picture of longhorn. And these longhorns resulted in cowboys doing what's known as long drives. So they would raise the cows in Texas and move the cows up to Missouri, because the cow in Texas would cost $3, but if you could get it to Missouri, you could sell that same same cattle for $40. And so these cowboys and this mentality of the Wild West, a lot of them were African American and Latinos. But the problem with all these cattle were they were starting to overgraze, eat too much of the land, eat too much of the grasses. And so blizzards and bitter cold were dealing with these, the Midwest area. So these longhorns were dying, they were rotting. There was severe drought, there were dust storms. It was just horrible conditions. They also invented something called barbed wire, which broke up and closed off the Wild West. Instead of being these wild open ranges, now they were broken up into smaller chunks. You also have homesteaders. These are people who would move out to the middle of modern day America in hopes of this free land or cheap land that they could live in and own and hopefully grow. The soil was deep and fertile. Things were good. There were still plows and barbed wire, and they were growing hard kernel wheat, so they were able to get going with their farms. Rain at first, but then it turned to drought. And then you have animals coming in. You have all these other issues that these homesteaders were experiencing. A lot of Norwegians and Swedes and Germans were coming, and there was a group known as the Exodusters. These were African Americans who left Missouri and Louisiana to escape poverty and white violence, and they were heading to Kansas to get their land and to be able to start over and act as free as they could, despite the horrible conditions around them. Women in the West were essential. They were very important with homesteading. It was a very family affair. It wasn't just a male-dominated society. Utah was the second state to allow the right to vote, and they had major influences of religion and women being involved within the state of Utah. There were some environmental challenges, like I mentioned a second ago: grasshoppers, wildfires, hailstorms, tornadoes, blizzards. Water and lumber or trees were very hard to find. So what they would do is they'd build their what they called sod houses, which are basically just giant chunks of dirt that they would build homes out of. By the 1900s, half the cattle and sheep and a third of the cereal crops and 3/5 of the wheat all came from this middle area. It got nicknamed the breadbasket of America. Now, we also are going to create the first national park. With the West expansion, Congress started to realize, hey, we need to not just give up all of the land. We need to preserve sites of unusual natural splendor. So Yosemite over in California was the first one in 1864. Then Yosemite was the first one to get some land, but the first actual national park was Yellowstone in 1872. They have thermal hot springs and different things that make it a beautiful place to visit. A national park is a public park or pleasuring ground for the benefit and enjoyment of the people. America were unsettling the West by taking it from native people who already lived there. And this is a constant struggle that we're going to see with the remainder of Chapter 16, is that the white people were coming west, taking over lands that had been possessed by the natives for hundreds of years and taking it for their own. Now, the Civil War and Indians on the plain. Now, after the Civil War, we started to order these Native Americans into what we called reservations. And so there were these things called the Reservations War, which were very messy and bitter, which were the American soldiers versus the natives. In 1862, Dakota fighters angered their anger boiled over. They killed over 400 whites, men, women, and children. Congress canceled all treaties and expelled them from Minnesota. And in response to that, there was a independent group of Colorado citizens who formed a militia, and they attacked the Cheyennes without being provoked. The Cheyennes were peaceful people. They weren't causing any problems, but this Colorado militia went and attacked them. Ultimately, there were constant battles between natives and whites, and this kind of, for the most part, ended in 1878. And it was referred to by the white people as the Indian problem, very derogatory and very negative towards Native Americans. President Grant comes into play. He institutes a peace policy. He believed that the natives could become equal with whites, with white Christianity and white ways. So let's teach them our religion and let's teach them our ways, and then we can be able to have peace. There's this thing called acculturation, which is the adoption of white man's ways, and that was kind of the mentality. Hey, they established boarding schools, and they said, hey, let's teach these native people the ways of white people. Let's bring them into our culture. Here we have a quote from one of those people at an Indian boarding school from a young man. He said, I felt that I was no more Indian, but would be an imitation of a white man. They started to take away their customs and their cultures and different things. They created something known as the Bureau of Indian Affairs, but it was very corrupt. There were a lot of two-faced officials. They would say one thing to the natives and then go back to the government and report something very different. There were court cases that ultimately ruled that the natives were wards of the government. So the government was in charge of all the Native Americans and what they did. You had this thing called the Dawes Severalty Act, which divided the tribal lands, these reservations and different lands that they had, into individual land holdings. So instead of having a large group or large area for the natives, that each individual natives would be given a small chunk of land in hopes that things would normalize. Well, it failed horribly for the Native Americans. Now, Sitting Bull, he was a part of the Lakota Sioux tribe, refused to go to a reservation. So we have Lieutenant Colonel Custer. He said, hey, there's gold in South Dakota where these Sitting Bull and these Sioux tribes were. There were 7,000 Native Americans gathered at this little Bighorn River in Montana, and Custer ultimately went to attack them, thinking, hey, we'll be able to easily overtake them. But the natives killed all 210 men that were there. This is known as Custer's Last Stand. And the American government, the American people, looked at it as a way to justify the American conquest of Indians, or as the Americans referred to them as savages. Ultimately, all Native Americans eventually were forced into reservations, whether they liked it or not. Now, in these reservations, many of the natives, despite being officially not allowed to, they passed on languages and histories and traditional arts and medicines. They encouraged these younger Native Americans to study hard and to learn English and develop skills to help them succeed later on in life. And there was this thing called the ghost dance movement in the 1880s and 1890s, which the Native Americans practiced, which their hope and their belief was that it would help resurrect the bison. It would bring the bison back to the Great Plains, which was a huge resource for the natives. But it would also call a great storm to drive whites back across the Atlantic. Now, as we've talked about moving west and these different things, we had some groups. We had the Indians, and as the white men referred to them as savages. You had pioneers and cowboys and gun-slinging sheriffs. And it's kind of that Western, Wild West mentality. You had Buffalo Bill Cody. And so here are just some pictures of natives and pioneers and cowboys and kind of that Western town and different things. And so this ultimately sums up Chapter 18, Conquering a Continent, between 1854 and 1860.